Hello and welcome to Straight Onto Disney, a Disney deep dive analysis podcast, where each week I, your host Jonathan, takes a deep dive into the history of each Disney film and the legacy that they left behind. I'd like to remind you that you can follow me on Instagram at Straight Onto Disney Pod, and you can email me your thoughts at straightontodisneypod@gmail.com. Hello and welcome to this week's podcast, where we're going to be diving into the 50s, starting with Cinderella. Before we start, there's always mousekeeping to attend to. Disney Adventure World and the World of Frozen are now officially open at Disneyland Paris. Walt Disney Studios is now Disney Adventure World. And there's also the Rapunzel's Tangled ride that is open there too. It's been a bad week for an animatronic, as I'm sure you've seen the viral moment of Olaf falling in World of Frozen, and the crows have been at Rapunzel's hair, so animatronics better stay safe at the moment. And the last bit of news is that Wally and Eve will be meeting and greeting guests Wednesdays this April for Earth Month, and that'll be at the Pixar Place Hotel in Disneyland, California. But it's great to see some Wally and Eve representation in the parks. Yeah, it's only going to be for the month, but it's really nice to see, and I hope that this means they've got more in the pipeline, hopefully, which would be really fun and cool. Cinderella. The film was directed by Ben Sharpstein as supervising director, Wilfred Jackson, Hamilton Lusk, and Clyde Guinomi. The film was produced by Walt Disney. The story was by William Peed, Erdman Penner, Ted Sears, Winston Hibler, Homer Brightman, Harry Reeves, Kenneth Anderson, and Joe Rinaldi. The film stars Illene Woods as Cinderella, Eleanor Audley as Lady Tremaine, Verma Felton as the fairy godmother, Claire Dubry as additional voices, Rhoda Williams as Drizella, James McDonald as Jack, Gus, and Bruno, Helene Stanley as additional voices, Louis Van Ruchen as the King and Grand Duke, and Don Barclay as the Doorman, which was a performative model. Additional casts that are also uncredited include Lucille Bliss as Anastasia, William Phipps as the Prince, Mike Douglas as the Prince's singing voice, Marion Darrington as the Birds, Clarice Nash as Birds, Lucifer and Major, Pino Kovic as Bruno, the Barks and the Grand Duke's Screams, June Foray as Lucifer, John Woodbury as Mouse 1, LeSue Williams as Mouse 2, 3, Ruvinesius as Mouse 3, Clint McCauley as Mouse 4, June Sullivan as Mouse 5, Helen Solbert as Mouse 6, Betty Lou Gerson as the narrator, Candy Candido as Gus, Larry Garrett as the lackey. The film was edited by Donald Holliday. The studios was Walt Disney Productions, distributed by RKO Radio Pictures. The film had a premiere in Boston on February 15th, 1950, and was released on March 4th, 1950 for general release. The film had a budget of $2.2 million, and its gross revenue was $182 million. The film centers on Cinderella, the daughter of a widowed aristocrat who was forced to become a maid in her own home due to the abuse from her stepmother, Lady Tremaine, and stepsisters, Anastasia and Drizella. With the help of her mouse friends and the fairy godmother, Cinderella is with the help of her With the help of her mouse friends and the fairy godmother, Cinderella is able to attend a royal ball and meet Prince Charming, who changes her life forever. The film was the first fully bodied picture produced by the studio since Bambi in 1942. The film was a massive critical and commercial success. Soon released and reinvigorated the Disney company when they were nearing bankruptcy after a loss of over $4 million from the package films, as well as the failure of Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi. The film's classic status and success continue to this day. It is considered one of the best American animated films ever made, as selected by the American Film Institute, and was inducted into the Library of Congress National Film Register in 2018. A live action adaptation of the film was released in 2015, starring Lily James as the titular role. One second. Right. Do. And that's a nice 10-minute segment. That's not gonna be 10 minutes. I love it. Production history. So, am I speaking to it, which is why it's making it move? 1 second. Right. Walt Disney would first adapt Charles Perrault's fairy tale Cinderella as the last of 6 shorts of the as the last of 6 short films for his animation studio La Fograin in Kansas City in 1922. By December 1933, he planned to produce a second version as one of the Silly Symphony series, which, as we all know, is where Disney did adaptations of The Big Bad Wolf, did adaptations of the Three Little Pigs, Little Red Riding Hood, The Big Bad Wolf. Those kind of stories are where Disney adapted them. And that would have been with Bert Gillett and Frank Churchill attached as director and composer, respectively. The story department circulated an outline throughout the studio, inviting the entire staff to contribute ideas for the story and gags, some of which ended up in the final film. The outline also indicated the cast of characters, which included white mice and birds as indicated white mice and birds as Cinderella's playmates. However, the story proved to be too complicated to fit into a short, which is understandable. As we know now, with Cinderella, it's a really big story. To navigate that into a small short would be quite tricky and very time consuming and you'd lose a lot of the plot and a lot of the emotional stakes of said story. So I do agree that it was far better to push pause here. And it's a really interesting thing to think about, that this film could have been a small short in the Disney canon long before Disney had started doing these longer longer adaptations of feature films with Snow White. So it's an interesting thing to think about that this film could have been a small short, a blink of the eye, in a sense, compared to the legacy that it still has today, which is really interesting and unique to think about. And therefore, the idea was discarded because it was deemed too complicated. In 1937, anticipating the success of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Disney began exploring ideas for other feature films, and considered Cinderella among them. And that was amongst many contenders. By the spring of 1938, story artists Dorothy Ann Blanca Mahol, and Al Perkins were assigned to develop the script, with a 14-page outline completed by Perkins, and a 14 that is 14, isn't it? With a 14-page outline completed by Perkins on April 20th. On January 30th, 1940, Mahor and story artist Dana Coffey prepared another treatment, which closely followed the plot of Perret's original story. However, this included some new scenes and characters that included Pet Mouse Dusty and Pet Mouse. Not Pet Mouse. This included Pet Mouse Dusty and Pet Tortoise Clarissa, the stepsisters cat Bonbon, the prince's valet Spink, and the stepsisters' dancing instructor Monsieur Camela. Please forgive me if I butcher some of these translations. A rough storyboard and a number of visual development sketches were created for the project, but it was also soon put on hold. In this version, Cinderella's stepmother was named Florimel de la Porre. Her stepsisters were Wanda and Javotti, and the prince's name was Charles. At the story's climax, after Cinderella loses her glass slipper at the second ball and return home late, her stepfamily imprison her in a dungeon cellar. When Spink and his troop arrive at the De La Porre residence, Dusty takes the slipper and leads them to free Cinderella. The stepmother and stepsisters mock Cinderella's attempts to try on the slipper, but when it fits, the fairy godmother appears to declare her the princess to be, and Cinderella forgives her stepmother for mistreating her. And ultimately, I can see why they would want to dive into this version of the film. But honestly, from reading that, it kind of, from a writing point of view, it feels like there's far too many characters in this. There's far too many unnecessary characters I'm reading here. Do we really need the stepsisters dance teacher? So I can understand why you would put this version on hold, and this was seems to be very much a rough draft of what the film that we know and love today would become. So in September 1943, Disney would return to Cinderella, assigning Dick Humer and Joe Grant as story supervisors, and allocating a primary budget of $1 million for the film's production. but the work that followed did not progress. But the work that followed did not progress past the preparation of storyboards. One of the story ideas from that period included Cinderella encountering the prince before the ball. In a story draft from September 1st, 1944, Cinderella's stepmother sends her to a gypsy camp to sell her late mother's jewelry to pay for the stepsisters' upkeep, with Cinderella meeting the disguised prince in the camp. The draft also featured a new cast of Cinderella's mouse friends, which included Actor Mouse, Court Mouse, Traboda Mouse, Modest Mouse, and Mystery Mouse. I'm not gonna lie, those are really bad names. Like, really? Whose magical locket would summon the fairy godmother. Now that's actually a kind of neat idea, but I kind of like the way that it's done in the actual film, so it's interesting to see how different this film could have been from its initial release. An outline from June 20th, 1944 introduced the character of Jabba, a gossiping crow and another of Cinderella's animal friends, which was present in the story drafts over the next few years. By 1945, the story was halted, but sputtered up the following year, with Disney holding at least 3 story meetings in March and April 1946. After screenwriters Dalton S. Raymond and Maurice Raffel quarreled while writing Song of the South, Rapt was reassigned to work on Cinderella, and he suggested making Cinderella a less passive character. Rapt said that his thinking was, you can't have somebody who comes in and changes everything for you. You can't be delivered on a platter. You can't be delivered on a platter. You've got to earn it. So in my version, the fairy godmother said, it's okay till midnight, but from then on, it's up to you. I made Cinderella earn it, and what she had to do to achieve it was to rebel against her stepmother and stepsister stop being a slave in her own home. So I had a scene where they're ordering her around, and she throws the stuff back at them. She revolts, so they lock her up in the attic. I don't think anyone took my idea very seriously. That's a really interesting thing to think about, and it's a really unique quote when you think about how the live action Cinderella, which we'll touch on later on a bit, really delves into much more of this idea, but it's a really interesting way of thinking that, like we touched on with Snow White in her being her shoe rescuing herself, really, and her not rescuing herself, but in a sense of it was her attempts at survival. This version of Cinderella here would have seen this version of Cinderella here would have seen her really dive into who she is as a person, and her standing up for herself and having this kind of backbone in a sense that allows her to really, go, no, this is who I want to be, this is who I'm going to be. And the fairy godmother going, you've got till midnight, I'll help you here, but after that it's on your own, and you've got to make these choices for yourself. That is a really unique and interesting thing to think about when you're thinking towards younger audiences and viewers. This could have been a really unique and dynamic story that really would have been interesting at the time of the 1950s in terms of context of how women were viewed. Could have been a really unique and interesting thing to think about. So we have a quote here from Walt Disney about the reworking of Cinderella. I had too many interpretations of what Alice ought to be, being a literary thing. It has an appeal to the intellect, without anything to appeal to the emotions. These things are a keg of dynamite. I had too many interpretations of what Alice ought to be, being a literary thing. It has an appeal. It has an appeal to the intellect, without anything to appeal to the emotions. Those things are a keg of dynamite. I don't want any more of the because I don't feel myself either. I'm just corny enough. I want to be a bit right here in the heart. You pull Cinderella. You pull for Cinderella. You feel for Cinderella, which is a really interesting thing to think about in terms of diving into the way that Cinderella was crafted and created. Right. On March 24th, 1947. Thank you. On March 24th, 1947, Disney received a new story treatment of Cinderella from Ted Sears, Homer Brightman, and Harry Reeves, and ordered storyboards with the intention of having the film ready for a late 1949 release. By May 1947, the first rough phase of storyboarding was in the process, and an inventory report that same month suggested that the story would be told largely through the animals in the barnyard and their observations of Cinderella's day-to-day activities. At this stage, the prince was supposed to appear very early in the story, like the prince in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and have a slightly larger role. One of the storyboards introduced the prince as a hunter chasing a deer, but at the end of the sequence, it was to be revealed that they were actually friends and playing games. Another treatment from August 7th, 1947, and credited by Sears, Brightman, and Reeves, suggested a small European kingdom in the early 1800s as a setting for the film, and introduced a large cast of Cinderella's animal friends, including mice, birds, a dog, and a horse, all of which could talk, except for the birds. One of the scenes written for the treatment also had Cinderella also had Cinderella also had Cinderella also had Cinderella also had also had Cinderella communicating with the spirit of her late father and preparing to run away from the Shire. When the fairy godmother appears in an alternative ending, after the Duke discovering Cinderella's identity, she was shown being brought What on earth has it done that for? 1 second. Right, I'll do that bit again. In an alternative ending, after the Duke discovers Cinderella's identity, she was shown being brought to the castle to be reintroduced to the prince, who was surprised to learn Cinderella was actually a modest servant girl, instead of the princess he thought she was. But the prince's feelings for her were too were too strong to be bothered by this, and he embraces her, and the fairy godmother was to reappear and restore Cinderella's ball gown for the closing shot. Walt Disney himself reportedly cut Walt Disney reportedly cut this alternative ending because he felt it was overlong and did not give the audience the payoff, but the scene would later be incorporated into the video game Kingdom Hearts Birth for Sleep. Other deleted material included an abandoned song, tentatively titled The Cinderella Work Song, which was part of a fantasy sequence that was set to take place after Lady Tremaine told Cinderella that she could only attend the ball if she finished her chores and found it a suitable dress. So it's kind of a bit like the wishing song from Snow White, I think. I would assume that's the kind of thing they were gonna go for. In this abandoned sequence, Cinderella imagined herself multiplying into an army of maids in order to deal with her massive workload, all the while pondering what the ball itself would be like. The sequence was cut, but the title was applied to the song. The mice sing. Bleh. The scene was cut. No. The sequence was cut, but the title would be applied to the song that the mice would sing when they went. The sequence was cut, but the title was applied. The sequence would be cut, but the title was applied to the song the mice would sing when they woke into Cinderella's dress. Additionally, there was a scene that took place after the ball in which Cinderella was seen returning to her home and eavesdropping on her stepfamily, who were ranting about the mystery girl at the ball, and Cinderella was shown to be amused by this because they were talking about her without realizing it. Walt Disney also reportedly cut the scene because he thought Walt Disney reportedly cut the scene because he thought it made Cinderella look spiteful and felt that the audience would it's there. Sorry, I'm looking at this wrong. Spiteful and felt that Walt Disney reportedly cut the scene because he thought it made Cinderella look spiteful and felt the audience would lose sympathy with her. And ultimately, I'm not 100% sure if that's really the case here when it comes to Cinderella. It'd be more of a that she's able to start getting her own back a little bit on them. So I can understand why we would cut that scene, and ultimately why I can understand Disney's hesitance to include the scene in the final film, with you not having that scene in could have caused a risk to the character that they wanted audiences to grow in love with this kind, warm person who, even after everything that's happened to her, she still stays kind and loving. So I can understand why we wouldn't want to keep that scene in. So we're gonna dive into a little thing that I haven't really had the chance to dive into yet, and that's casting. So around 380 around 380 actresses and singers auditioned for the role of Cinderella before Illene Woods was cast in March 1948, which she personally announced to the nation, which she personally announced on national radio. In today's day, it would have been on Instagram, would have been on socials. And that would have been on national radio that same month. Woods was unaware of the casting process and got involved with the project when the songwriters Mac David and Jerry Livingston, who had been friends with Woods since working with her on her eponymous radio show on ABC Radio's Blue Network, asked her to make the demo recordings of some of the songs they had written for the film, including A Dream Is a Wish Your Heart Makes, Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo, and So This Is Love. That's so interesting that this is how she learned that the film was happening, that she was the one who originally was recording the demos. That's a really unique thing. I never knew that. So that's really interesting to hear. After Walt Disney heard the demo recordings, he was impressed with Wood's vocals and clear delivery and telephoned her 2 days later, asking her to come to the studio for an interview. Woods recalled in an interview with Deseret News that she and Disney met and talked for a while, and he said, "How would you like to be Cinderella?" To which she agreed. Woods was paid a total of $2,500 for her role. Nearly 500 actors auditioned for the role of Prince Charming. Mike Douglas got into the audition after his agent made him. Mike Douglas got into the audition after his agent made him an appointment for him in the studio and was selected as the character's singing voice. Disney personally hired William Phipps as the Prince's speaking voice, with Phipps completing his recording in 2 hours with Phipps completing his recording in 2 hours in an afternoon in January 1949. And he received about $100 for his recordings. Wow. Verma Fallon, who had voiced the elephant matriarch in Dumbo, was chosen for the role of the fairy godmother. She later became a regular voice actor for the Disney company. A radio actress, Eleanor Audie, was cast as Lady Tremaine. In their book, The Disney Villain, Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston described the experience of animating to her voice a difficult assignment. In their book, The Disney Villain, Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston described the experience of animating her voice to the character as a difficult assignment, but a thrilling one, working to that voice track with so much innuendo mixed in with the fierce power. Audley would later voice Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty. For the role of Anastasia, Disney personally selected Lucille Bliss, whom he frequently told to ad-lib. Me scroll right there. Oh my god! Stop move! I don't know why it's moving constantly. Right, stay. Can I do that? Yeah, I can on here. Right. Right, I'm going to start again. For the role of Anastasia, Disney personally selected Lucille Bliss, whom he frequently told to ad-lib during the recording sessions. A sound effects artist, Jimmy McDonald, voiced Jack and Gus, achieving a high-pitched sound of their voices by changing the speed of the recordings. For the role of Lucifer, a studio representative approached June Foray, asking her if she would do the voice of the cat. Foray replied that she could do anything and got the part. Other cast members included Rhonda Williams as Drizella and Louis Van Cullen as the King and the Grand Duke. So we have a quote here from Frank Thomas. Walt Disney blah 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 blah. We have a quote here from Frank Thomas. Walt insisted we planned Cinderella more carefully than prior films. We shot it all in live action first, so that we could evaluate it because we couldn't afford to make changes in the animation. The animation had to be right the first time. The live action was done without a costume or set. We'd work on a lonely soundstage to see whether the scene was going to We'd work on a lonely soundstage to see whether the scenes were going to work. Would they be too long, too short? Will it hold your interest? And that's a really unique and interesting thing to think about here. That this film, it had to work. With this film, it had to be done. It had to work. And you kind of had, there was no second chances with them messing this up. If it was messed up, it was messed up and would have failed. So it's a really interesting thing to think about and hear from one of the animators on this film, that there was no second chances. It was make or break when it came to animating this film, which I find really interesting that they shot this all in live action. And I would love to know if it still exists somewhere in the Disney archive, because that would be really unique and interesting to think about and dive into. But from a filmmaking point of view, that's a really unique thing think about and thinking about as a production. There was so little time, there was so little money here. You couldn't get this wrong. So starting in 1948, long before the animation process began, a live-action reference version of Cinderella was filmed on the soundstage with costumed actors mouthing to a playback of the dialogue soundtrack. The footage was then edited and sent to animators on large photostat sheets to duplicate. The studio had to use rotoscoping for earlier films, starting with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. But in an attempt to keep production costs down, Walt Disney insisted on using live-action footage much more extensively this time. In Cinderella, it was used not only to guide the animators with the movements of the characters, but also to pre-edit the story, eliminating scenes that did not work before the animators wasted time and money on footage, which actually is a really smart thing to think about. And it's interesting to see that this is where we've begun to see that being thought about here. That would not end up being used in the final film. Animators such as Frank Thomas but what's interesting here though is that animators such as Frank Thomas found the approach to be too restrictive, as they were not allowed to imagine anything that the actors did not present, since the kind of experimentation could necessarily change and cost extra money. Animators were instructed to draw from a certain directorial perspective head on to avoid difficult shots and angles, which Thomas compared to having your feet nailed to the floor, which is a really interesting thing to think about, and I think we've seen that in the last few years. In the last few years, definitely with VFX artists feeling a bit of the same, is that there was very much a mold here that if you stepped out of the mold, there was more money gonna have to be spent that we didn't have. So you can see it on one hand, the production side going, we don't have this money. This is going to save us time, money, which ultimately paid off. But you can also understand it from the artist's point of view of, I want to be able to experiment. I want to understand. So you can really see this clash of heads starting to become with this film, which is really interesting to listen and read about. So Helen Stanley was hired to provide the live-action reference for both Cinderella and Anastasia. She would later do the same kind of work of the characters of Princess Aurora in Sleeping Beauty and Anita Radcliffe in 101 Dalmatians. Prince Charmers was modelled by Jeffrey Stone, who also provided some additional voices in the film. Eleanor Audley and Rhonda Williams, who voiced Lady Tremaine and Drizella, also enacted their respective characters in live-action footage. The fairy godmother was modelled. For the first time, Walt turned to Tin Pan Alley songwriters to write the songs. The music of Tin Pan Alley would later become a recurring theme in Disney animation. Cinderella was the first Disney film to have songs published and copyrighted by the newly created. Cinderella was the first Disney film to have its songs published and copyrighted by the newly created Walt Disney Music Company. Before movie soundtracks became marketable. Mm-hmm. Songs in the film include "A Dream Is a Wish." Bleh. Songs in la da 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 da. Songs included in the film include "A Dream Is a Wish Your Heart Makes," "Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo," "So This Is Love," "Sing Sweet Nightingale," the work song, and the opening credits song titled "Cinderella." Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo became a hit. Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo. Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo. Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo became a hit single 4 times, with notable versions by Perry Como and the Fontaine Sisters. Woods beat exactly 309 girls for the part of Cinderella after some demo recordings of her singing a few of the film's songs were presented to Walt Disney. However, she had no idea she was auditioning for the part until Disney contacted her. She initially made the recordings for a few friends, who sent them to her. During production, Walt Disney pioneered the use of double-tracked vocals for the song "Sing Sweet Nightingale" before it had been used by artists in studio recordings, such as the Beatles. That's really interesting to hear and learn about. And something I've never come across, so it's really interesting that he's actually where double-track vocals were becoming the norm. When Woods had completed the day's recordings of "Sing Sweet Nightingale," Walt listened and asked if she could sing harmony with herself. She was apprehensive about the idea, as it was unheard of, though she ended up singing the double recording, including second and third part harmonies. Illene Woods reveals the innovation in an interview. Yeah, I knew there was going to be a lot of production history. Right, development. The Disney version of Cinderella was based on the protagonist of the French version of the fairy tale by Charles Perrault, Cinderella, written in 1698. Cinderella was animated by Mark Davies and Eric Larson, but the two animators did not have the same perception of the character, accentuating the elegance of Davies and Larson's option for simplicity. This resulted in Cinderella being a more complicated character than her predecessor Snow White, due to her duality. As done with other Disney films, Walt Disney hired actress Helene Stanley to perform the live-action reference for Cinderella. She later was asked to do the same with that of Aurora and Anita in both Sleeping Beauty and 101 Dalmatians. According to Christopher Finch, the author of The Art of Walt Disney, about 400 contestants auditioned for the role of Cinderella. Out of all of them, Walt Disney chose Illene Woods. A really interesting comment here by both Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston when discussing that of Lady Tremaine. The villain-victim relationship was one of the very best we had on any feature. Lady Tremaine was the only villain to live beside her victim day by day, which is really interesting to think about. Yes, she is one of the only characters where the villain and the protagonist, the protagonist and the antagonist, are both very much in the same room a lot of the time, which is a really interesting thing to think about. Lady Tremaine was animated by Frank Thomas. He commented that Lady Tremaine was the driving force throughout the film, and that she had to be believable, even though she was far from human, to be considered a serious threat, which is a really interesting thing to think about here, that these animators were really making sure that these characters felt believable and you could understand a character from the way that they walked, the way that they talked, which is really interesting to dive into and look at here. Walt Disney, when talking about the fairy godmother, suggested that the fairy godmother should have a kind. When discussing that of the fairy godmother, Walt Disney suggested that the fairy godmother should have a kindly voice with a certain age in it. I don't see her as being goofy or stupid, but rather as having a wonderful sense of humor, which is really interesting to think about, and that's certainly something that comes across on screen. The fairy godmother's design underwent numerous changes in development, with the original source becoming difficult to narrow down. Eventually, layout artist Ken O'Connor looked to his wife, Mary Alice O'Connor, for inspiration. The fairy godmother's design was what Ken tried to imagine how she'd look a few decades older. Dedicated community work and charities, Mary Alice's personality served to fit the character. That's really interesting to denote and connote here, is that we're getting this from this really unique character. The rest of the film, the prince, much like the prince in Snow White, had a much more larger role and had more character development than what he ultimately receives in the final version of the film. The third film, however, would rectify this, which is a really interesting thing to discuss about in the legacy section is that the prince at one point had a solo number, the title entitled "The Face That I See in the Night," in which he sang about how he couldn't stop dreaming of the mysterious girl who stole his heart at the ball. So what we've dissected here is this really unique and interesting, real, dynamic production history, and it's really interesting that we're seeing such a diverse and really complicated production history that you don't really hear a lot of people talking about as much, and how much of a struggle between production and animators had in their visions for this film, which I find really unique and interesting to dissect and analyze. Which I find also really unique to this film, in that this film practically cemented the legacy of Disney in terms of it was on the scale of bankruptcy, and Cinderella saved it. And as we go through these films, we tend to see that princess films are the true savior of the Disney company, which is really interesting and unique to think about when it comes to the way that things are always presented when it comes to the Disney company. So I do really find that really interesting and unique to dive into and dissect. So the film. We're gonna dive into the film now. So Cinderella is the much loved daughter of a widowed aristocrat who decides to remarry because he believes that his daughter deserves a mother's care. Ultimately, her father marries Lady Tremaine, a proud and confident woman who has two daughters of her own, Anastasia and Drizella. The two stepsisters are jealous. The two sisters are jealous of Cinderella's The two stepsisters are jealous of Cinderella's beauty. After Cinderella's father passes away, Lady Tremaine reveals herself to be a cold and cruel boss who shames her daughter's jealousy of Cinderella's delight and loveliness. Lady Tremaine and her daughters take over the estate and start to harm and mistreat Cinderella, ultimately forcing her to become a solitary. Lady Tremaine and her two daughters ultimately take over the estate and start to harm and mistreat Cinderella, ultimately forcing her to become a maid in her own home, while also squandering off the fortune until there is nearly nothing left. Despite this, Cinderella remains a kind and gentle soul, befriending the animals in the barn and the mice and the birds who live around the estate. For with each morning she finds new hope that someday her dreams of joy will soon come true. Someday, my no, that's Snow White, you idiot. Oh, I forgot that's how she. Sorry. One morning, Cinderella and the mice find a new mouse in the home. One morning, Cinderella and the mice find a new mouse. One morning, Cinderella and the mice find a new mouse in the house, who was caught in a mousetrap. She gives him the name Octavius, or Gus for short, and some new clothes, and informs Jack to warn Gus about Lucifer, Lady Tremaine's wicked cat. The two mice spy on Lucifer as Cinderella starts her chores. When Cinderella is giving breakfast to the animals, Lucifer chases Gus and he hides under Anastasia's teacup. Cinderella delivers breakfast to her stepsisters. When Anastasia opens her teacup and finds Gus, she screams to her mother about it right after, accusing Cinderella. Lady Tremaine punishes Cinderella with extra chores, along with Helena to give Lucifer a bath, much to his annoyance. At the royal palace, the king and the Grand Duke organize a ball in an effort to find a suitable wife for Prince Charming, considering the fact that the king wants to see grandchildren before his death. Every eligible maiden in the kingdom is requested to attend the ball. Cinderella asks her stepmother if she may attend the ball, since she is still a part of the family. Lady Tremaine reluctantly agrees, provided if Cinderella finishes her chores and finds a nice dress to wear. With Cinderella too distracted with extra chores, her animal friends, led by Mary, Jack, and Gus, fix up a gown that belonged to Cinderella's late mother. Jack and Gus go downstairs and scoop up Anastasia's old sash and Scoop up Anastasia's old sash and Scoop up Anastasia's old sash and Drizella's old beads. After they throw them on the floor, escaping with them before Lucifer unsuccessfully catches both mice. The animals finish Cinderella's dress just as the carriage arrives. When Cinderella comes down wearing her new dress, Lady Tremaine recognizes the beads and sash. She compliments the gown, pointing out the beads to Drizella. Enraged by the theft of their discarded items by their stepsister, the stepsisters viciously rip the gown into rags before snootily leaving for the ball with Lady Tremaine, who bids Cinderella good night. Heartbroken, Cinderella runs outside to the garden and breaks down into tears. As Cinderella nears the point of giving up on her dreams, her fairy godmother appears and transforms a pumpkin into a carriage, 4 of the mice into horses, Major the horse into a coachman, and Bruno the dog into a footman. She also bestows upon Cinderella a new silver ball gown with a pair of glass slippers. Cinderella leaves for the ball after her godmother alerts her that the spell will wear off at the stroke of midnight. At the ball, the prince denies every girl that he meets him until he sees Cinderella. The two fall strongly in love and dance alone throughout the castle grounds. Her stepfamily does not recognize her, but Lady Tremaine thinks there is something familiar about her. However, she is unable to make the connection when the Grand Duke closes the curtains to give the couple some privacy. As the clock starts to chime midnight, Cinderella flees the ball and her carriage, losing one of her glass slippers in her rush. The Duke, realizing what is happening, orders the guards to go after her, but Cinderella and the animals manage to avoid them. Before being safely away, Cinderella's gown reverts into rags, with everything else turning back to normal. Seeing she still has one glass slipper, she smiles grateful, remembering the fairy godmother's magic. Back at the palace, the Duke tells the king of Cinderella's sudden exit and the lost slipper. He then reveals the prince's declaration that he will marry only the lady whose foot this glass slipper wears, and the Duke is assigned by the king to find her. The following morning, the king announces that the Grand Duke will visit every house in the kingdom to find the girl whose foot the glass slipper belongs to, so that she can be married to the prince. When the news reaches Cinderella's household, her stepmother and stepsisters prepare for the Duke's arrival. Overhearing this, Cinderella dreamily hums the song played at the ball. Recognizing that Cinderella was the girl who danced with the prince, Lady Tremaine follows Cinderella to her room and locks her stepdaughter in the attic, in one last-ditch attempt to ruin her dreams. What a bitch. When the Duke arrives, Jack and Gus retrieve the key to Cinderella's room from her stepmother's pocket and bring it upstairs. But before they can deliver it to Cinderella, they are ambushed by Lucifer, who traps Gus under a bowl. The other mice and the birds fail to get Lucifer to release Gus, until Bruno soon chases Lucifer out the tower window, allowing Jack and Gus to give Cinderella the key to free herself. As the Duke prepares to leave after the stepsisters unsuccessfully try on the slipper, Cinderella appears and requests to try it on, knowing the slipper will fit. Lady Tremaine trips the footman, causing him to drop it and shatter the slipper. Tremaine's victory is short-lived, as Cinderella then produces the other glass slipper, much to her stepmother's surprise and horror at this complete, irrefutable proof of the maiden's identity. The Duke slides the slipper onto her feet, and it fits perfectly. Cinderella and Prince Charming celebrate their wedding and live. Cinderella and Prince Charming celebrated their wedding and live happily ever after. When it comes to the legacy of Cinderella, there's so much legacy when it comes to that of Cinderella. Obviously, a massive part of that legacy is within Disney parks, with you having much of the legacy is that Cinderella Castle is the icon of Magic Kingdom, and it is the icon of many of the Disney parks in terms of castle. So that definitely is a big, massive part of the Disney parks. Cinderella, Anastasia, Drizella, Lady Tremaine, and Fairy Godmother, and Prince Charming at times are meetable characters within the parks. There's the Prince Charming's Regal Carousel is one of the many attractions in Fantasyland. So there's a real big legacy there when it comes to Disney parks. There's also Bibbidi Bobbidi Boutique. There's so much that it's a lot to dive into, which is why I'm going to just suggest you go and do deep dive into that. And I'm sure you audiences already know a lot of that when it comes to the legacy part of Cinderella. Cinderella is Cinderella as well. As I mentioned earlier on, we have the 2015 live-action Cinderella film, which is a big favourite of Second Star to the Rides, which stars Lily James, Richard Madden, and Kate Blanchett, and Helena Bonham Carter in some of the many titular roles, and is arguably one of the better live actions that they've done. So if you want to see how they did that, there's always that. It's a big part of its legacy that this film still has, as well as really catapulting Disney into mainstream a bit more than the package films had done beforehand, which obviously it would have done. We have Cinderella is also part of ABC's Once Upon a Time, and they retold Cinderella twice in the show, and they did Cinderella in the first season, and then when the show did a kind of soft reboot in season 7, Cinderella was a major part of that. Cinderella also has a long history with Kingdom Hearts being part of She's one of the princesses of Heart, as her world was destroyed by Maleficent, but was later taken into captivity. She was one of the many 7 captured by Riku and Maleficent. Her role was the same as the rest of the characters. She's only found having been imprisoned in a glass coffin in a deep sleep with the other princesses in the Great Hall. So there's always that little bit of deep dive here. So it's really interesting to see here. She's also appeared in Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep, and as I also touched on a little bit, Cinderella had 2 direct-to-DVD sequels, that being Cinderella 2 and Cinderella 3, A Twist in Time, which is actually a really good sequel film, so I recommend going to check that out. And that's where I'm gonna wrap this week's episode off. So what we've learned this week is that Cinderella has such a rich history in terms of its legacy, in terms of the way the film was crafted and created, and there's such a big, heavy production history there that I think sometimes we forget about a little bit, which is a really interesting thing to think about, especially going forward and seeing how much of a legacy it still has today. So, as always, you can follow me on Instagram at StraightOnToDisneyPod, and you can email me your thoughts at StraightOnToDisneyPod@gmail.com. Thank you all for listening, and bye!